So Jean-Guy Sauriol stumbles on an obscure book about some guy who rode across the Atlantic in 1953. Then sometime later he heard about a young girl who did the same thing. So he thinks, me too. I'll be the third Canadian, but I'll be the oldest and I'll be the fastest. And so it was. Jean-Guy. Salut.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for the invitation. Well, I'm Jean-Guy Sauriol. I'm an ocean rower, and I've been ocean-free now for 133 days. Now, I'm very happy that I'm following Stephen's presentation or talk, because now I can install some sanity to this discussion. So I did become 60 on the ocean on December 31st. I know that you had a very tough winter, but look at this picture. I'm wearing a Gore-Tex paddling jacket, and I'm at just a few hundred nautical miles from Africa, so it was really cold there as well. This is the boat that I used to row the ocean. It was called Maple. It was 21 feet long, 7 feet wide. It has 2 watertight cabins. It's designed to self-right if I capsize, and I did capsize a few times. We don't see it, but there's 3 solar panels that generated power to 2 batteries, and that's what fed all the electrical equipment on board. Ocean rowing is a sport. It's not as popular as going into space. Apparently, there's more people who have gone into space than people who have rowed an ocean. But it's a sport mainly in Europe, and especially in England. More than 50% of all the ocean rowers come from England, so it was really unusual to have a Canadian do this. There's about a dozen Canadians who have rowed an ocean, but only 4 in total who have rowed solo in ocean. And I was the third one to row the Atlantic from what we call from east to west. And there's one woman from Montreal last year who rowed the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, from west to east. As it was mentioned, I became fascinated by rowing or crossing an ocean in a small boat when I read the story of Haynes Lindemann. He had done it twice in the 1950s, one time in a canoe and one time in a kayak. I had no thoughts of doing it in a kayak, but when I read the story of Katie Spots, she had done it in a rowing boat, and when I saw a boat, that's when I realized that's how it could be done safely. This is me rowing my boat in July 2013, so I just picked up the boat, and I'm not a rower. I had no rowing experience, and I spent basically 6 hours rowing the boat, and you can see here that I'm on Plymouth Sound in England, and the ocean is flat like a pancake. So I didn't even have the advantage of having practice on some waves. But rowing an ocean is really not like rowing a regular boat. In fact, if my rowing coach had seen me, he would have been disgusted by how I was rowing the boat. The one thing I learned very quickly in the process, because rowing an ocean, especially for a Canadian who wants to row it from the Canary Islands to Barbados, it's a huge logistical problem, because all the expertise is in England. The boat was built in England, and I had to do all my training outside, not in the boat, but in just smaller boats. But very early I learned that you have to trust people, and you have to learn to trust people with your life and with your money. And I was very lucky that I did find somebody who could build me a boat, Jamie Fabrizio, and also Tony Humphreys, who became my technical advisor and my weather guru while I was on the ocean. I split my voyage in 3 different segments, the first 3 weeks, the middle 4 weeks, and the last 3 weeks. The first 3 weeks, as you can see here on the chart, I was trying to go from the Canary Islands. I left from the Gran Canaria, which is one of the islands of the Canary Islands, and I was aiming for Barbados. But the first couple of weeks, I looped around a few times, and that's because the wind was against me. I had mostly south winds and southwestern winds, and everything was pushing me back to where I came from. I was a bit anxious at times because I was afraid that I might just go north enough to hit the islands. And when I asked Tony if it was a good idea to bring him back to the Canary Islands and have him hire a boat in case, he said, unfortunately, there's no safe plan B. You just have to wait out the conditions. And eventually, the conditions did change. They always do change. And the reason people do this route, it's because you go through the trade winds, and the natural path of the trade winds is from the islands to Barbados. So the wind changed on December 13th. Fortunately, on December 13th, the wind patterns changed from south, and it went to west, went to north, and went to east. So that created wave patterns coming from all over the place. And then on December 17th and December 18th, I capsized 3 times. The first time I was on the deck rowing. So you get in the water, and you say very quickly, it's time to get out. And despite all the good work of Rob Stewart, I was afraid of the sharks in the water. So I got back in the boat, and for the next couple of days, I didn't row. I just waited out that the ocean calmed down, and it did calm down. Now, when I started to row on December 13th, I met a sailboat, the Callisto. It was a crew delivering a boat from the Canary Islands to St. Martin's, and we met about 150 feet apart. There's a bit of a story with the boat because I saw the boat about an hour and a half before we met, and the sail was becoming bigger and bigger. Eventually, I thought, wow, it's coming right at me. So I had on my boat a gadget called the AIS. It's an automatic identification system. It's a gadget that sends information about your boat to the surrounding boats and receives information from the other boats on your machine. Fortunately, it looked like they didn't have an AIS or that it wasn't on, so I couldn't see that they were there or that they could see me. So I called on the VHF radio, and I didn't get any answer. So at that point, I was sort of freaking out. So I had to trigger a flare. Now, I had so many flares on the boat, and you don't want to trigger too many flares, but I had to trigger one. Eventually, they did see me. Maybe they had seen me even without me triggering the flare, but it worked out, and they went by about 150 feet apart. We had a bit of a chat. They asked me if everything was okay, and I said yes, and they just went on. So I didn't row for a couple of days, and then I started rowing again on December 20th. That was a very good stretch, those 4 weeks. I was finally regaining my strength because the first couple of weeks when I was looping around the islands, I had really exhausted myself. And there's a dirty little secret of ocean rowing. The big days are the easiest days, and the small days are the hardest days. So when you do very little mileage, it's because you're rowing against the conditions. And when you do the 50-mile day, it's because you have a tailwind and everything is going fine. So I was gradually regaining my strength. And this was the time that I was getting closer to Christmas. And by Christmas, I had about 2,000 miles to go. So in about a month, I had done roughly 600 miles. The week before Christmas and New Year's was a big week for me. I was spending Christmas and New Year's alone for the first time in many, many years. But also it was my birthday on December 31st. The highlight of the day on my birthday was having a live interview on French CBC News Network, and I had 3 newscasters saying happy birthday to me while I listened live on my satellite phone. It was quite magical. After January 1st, it really started to go very well. I was averaging in excess of 50 miles per day, and by the time I got to mid-January, I had only 1,000 miles to go. So you see, it took about a month to do 600 miles, and then in 3 weeks, I did another 1,000 miles. This is me rowing. I had quite a bit of rain at some point. This is the time of the year where it rains regularly, not all day, but regularly. And again, I was still wearing my Gore-Tex paddling jacket. You hear a story about ocean rowers eventually rowing naked. I didn't do that. I was cold most of the time, and especially when it was windy and raining, you could be very close to hypothermia. By mid-January, the ocean had slowed to a crawl again, and I had just slight conditions against me, so I decided to take a break while I waited for the conditions to change in my favor again. I took the opportunity to clean the boat. One of the things I had to do, I knew I had to do while I'd be on the ocean, is go in the water and check if the boat was clean, because as you move slowly on the ocean, you gather barnacles and other kinds of growth, and that eventually can slow down the boat dramatically. So because it was calm, because I wasn't rowing anyway, I went in the water. Couldn't really use the word jumped in the water. I cautiously tiptoed into the water. And I was very lucky. The boat was spotless. And so I didn't have to spend much more time than I needed to. And I was very happy. I didn't see any creatures. Afterwards, I understood that I was probably too far from anywhere to have fishes. I didn't see any fish at all. So I suppose if there's no small fishes, then I guess there's no big fishes as well. Eventually, I realized that I could still do it in 75 days, despite the fact that I'd been slowed down quite a bit. I lost 2 weeks at the beginning, and I lost 3 days now. And the average for a solo ocean rower is roughly 80 to 85 days. So I was close to being able to do it, so I just increased my tempo and increased my rowing sessions, and eventually I arrived in Barbados in 74 days and 3 hours. As you can see, the first picture here, that's my control panel. I had all kinds of communication equipment, and I kept in touch with my wife. I was speaking with her every day. And although I was alone in the middle of the ocean, I never felt lonely, except for one day when we didn't speak because she was traveling to Barbados. And when you look at all this equipment, and you think about the German gentleman in 1953 who rode the ocean, look at this and really, I mean, even though this is quite unusual what I did, in some ways I feel that today's adventurers are really wussies when you compare that to what these guys did. I lost 15 to 20 pounds. And that's despite the fact that I was eating about 3,500 calories per day. It was actually less than my budget. I had budgeted for 5,000 calories per day for 90 days, so I had 450,000 calories on board. But I was eating very well balanced food, a lot of energy bars, so I wasn't hungry at all. I was just eating what I needed to eat. I did see a bit of wildlife, a couple of whales, a lot of flying fishes. Oftentimes in the morning I would wake up and there'd be 1, 2, 3, even sometimes a dozen. That day I think I had 8 or 9 flying fishes. I guess the most wildlife I saw, though, was cargo ships and sailboats, so it was still humans. I think it's obvious that rowing an ocean carries with it a number of risks, but I must say that I never felt in danger. And at the end of the day, crossing an ocean in a small boat will always be a story of weather. If you have the really bad weather, then you can be in trouble. I did have high winds, maybe 25 to 30 knots. I did have waves, 15, 16, 17 feet, but I didn't get the hurricane. And that's the reason why people do this crossing at this time of the year, in December, January. It's because it's out of hurricane season. When I left, before I left, I was always thinking that what I fear the most is my first night out. I thought I would just freak out the first night out. And really, it was a non-event. I suppose it's because I was a bit seasick, or I was too focused on other things, or I was just too tired. I didn't have time to be afraid. The other thing I was really afraid about was going into the water to clean the boat, and I must say that I was afraid up until the time that I was back in the boat. I did have a couple of anxious moments, as I said earlier, when I was looping around, and Tony told me not to worry, the conditions will turn, and eventually you'll just continue towards Barbados. Few final thoughts. Despite all this, I don't consider myself to be either an adventurer or an athlete. I think I'm just addicted to doing things, and addicted to being successful at doing things. Now, that said, I really enjoyed my time on the ocean. If life is simple, you just row, eat, sleep. Also, you become very familiar with the boat. You become one with the boat. The boat becomes an extension of you. You understand how the boat behaves. You understand how the boat will react if you put the rudder this way. And when we looked at the chart, I really had almost like a straight line from Canaries to Barbados after I had done my couple of loops. I find also that you learn a lot from the questions people ask you. People often ask me, when they know that I have a son, they say, is your son like you? And I say, I wasn't even like myself when I was 25 years old. And my son has done now, at 25 years old, things that I wouldn't have done or I didn't do when he was 25 years old. I think at the end of the day, I'm happy that we're both ourselves. The other thing I learned, too, is that when I was preparing to do this, I read 15 books. And oftentimes, my wife and I would discuss about this, and then she would say, and you really want to do that? And I would say, yes. And then I would go back and really think about it, and I would say, yes, I really want to do this. And I think having read all those books and having had all those discussions really prepared me for everything that happened on the ocean. Everything I read in the books happened, and I was ready to handle it, and I was ready to go whatever happened on the ocean. I'm going to finish by saying that everybody has an ocean to row. I took it literally. I don't think you have to. It could be just talking to your kid, or it could be just stop smoking. But I think everybody has an ocean to row, and I suggest that you try to find it and that you reach your goal. Thank you.
Bravo, Jean-Guy. So while we're getting our picture taken, I have two questions.
Yep.
The distance you traveled was 4,815 kilometers.
Yep.
How many strokes was it?
Was a lot of strokes. No hard strokes, just oar strokes. People say maybe 1 million.
1 million strokes.
Yeah, yeah. You row about 10, 12 hours a day, maybe 20 strokes a minute. So that's a lot of strokes.
That's a lot of strokes. Now, you may not know it, but Jean-Guy is an actuary.
Yes, I am.
So that means you would have been aware of your odds.
Actually, I was. You can be certain that I looked at all the stats, and I actually understood that people who abandoned their crossing, who didn't complete their crossing, had abandoned after 7 to 10 days. So I knew that as soon as I would get into 7 to 10 days range, I would finish. And I think I understand why people decide to quit before 7 and 10 days. It's because you're still within range of the Coast Guards. So because when you go beyond 300 miles, that's the end of it. They're not going to get you. You're going to have to call on the distress signal and get a boat who's nice enough to rescue you.
That's splendid. Thank you.
Thank you.